I'm Josiah Failauer. I'm founder and operator of Be Amazing Interpreting and hosting this presentation today. Really glad to have Dr. Barnum with us today. I wanted to start by taking just a couple of minutes to give a little bit of background to this presentation and why I'm hosting it today. So any interpreters out there, you've probably experienced this before. We may get the opportunity to interpret for some maybe class or some person or some assignment. And it's nice to have a job, to work, earn some money. That's all wonderful. But we also get the mutual benefit of being able to learn something amazing in the process. Sometimes life-changing things. And I'm sure many of you have had that experience. I had that experience interpreting for Dr. Barnum for one of her college courses not too long ago. And was just particularly struck with her perspectives on many things, obviously specifically related to mental health and overall health of the person. And so I immediately thought of Dr. Barnum when I was planning this presentation. So right now, of course, we're living in the buzzword of the season is unprecedented times, right? And at this time, psychological stress is all around us. Even during normal times, interpreters are prone to psychological stress, but even more so now. And everybody's experiencing it, not just interpreters, but we are also experiencing it. So it's good to first recognize that. Being that we work with people, even more so, we may be prone to psychological stress or vicarious trauma or specific issues that come with that. Dr. Barnum is going to talk about several of those things today. So I had my first conversation with Dr. Barnum and realized that her perspective on interpreting was very unique, very interesting. So I started explaining to Dr. Barnum in brief the work of interpreters. And what was amazing is Dr. Barnum started explaining back to me some unique aspects of interpreting that I had never really thought about before. So with Be Amazing Interpreting, I try to spend my energy hosting opportunities that help us to do our work better, to be better humans, and to encourage other people in pursuing health and excellence in their work. If you do want to keep track of future opportunities that Be Amazing offers, you can do that by following my Facebook page. You can find it just by searching Be Amazing Interpreting, or you can email me at the email that I sent out, the link to this presentation. So really my passion is to support the interpreting community, helping us understand ourselves better, helping us understand our work better, hopefully be more healthy interpreters, have positive mental health. So I invited Dr. Barnum today to share her perspective. What's really great is she brings in an outsider perspective, which I think in interpreting is very important. Also, the intersection of her work, which she'll talk more about, I'm sure, I think crosses at an interesting intersection with the work of interpreters. So again, I'm very excited for her presentation. I want to thank Dr. Barnum deeply for being willing to present to us today. I'm glad that you all are here. I think it will be incredibly valuable. And with that, I would like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Barnum and then hand over the reins. So Dr. Barnum received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology with a specialty in somatic psychology. She received a master's degree in clinical psychology from the Santa Barbara Graduate Institute, and she is particularly proud to have her master's degree in human relations from the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Barnum is a licensed professional counselor in Oklahoma. She's trained in numerous evidence-based modalities, including CBT, EMDR, emotionally focused therapy, DBT, sensory motor psychotherapy, and EEG neurofeedback. Okay. And as the clinical director and founder of Life, Mind, Us, Dr. Barnum also drew upon her training in somatic and body-based therapies, such as yoga and mindfulness, to work with diverse populations. This included addressing issues ranging from severe childhood neglect and trauma, PTSD, gender and sexuality, mild traumatic brain injuries and addiction, to the resolution of intergenerational trauma in families. Her doctoral research into attachment and attachment trauma supports her teaching interests in trauma resolution, developmental neurobiology, and working with couples and families. With over 25 years of experience in the therapeutic field, Dr. Barnum has a pragmatic approach that aims to support, instruct, and advise students in the Clinical Mental Health Certificate Program at the University of Oklahoma. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Linda Barnum to you today.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. I always think I would be way more impressive if we heard about how I was able to keep my teenagers' rooms tidy when they went through adolescence, because that was traumatic if you've ever raised teenagers. So, but I am very excited to be here today with everything that I've been learning about your world. And I feel very privileged and honored to be included in it too today. When Josiah invited me to do this, at first I was like, well, everybody's just got trauma, right? We're all dealing with this very stressful time. So at first, my lens of this world was a lens that I've had with many of my populations that I've worked with. But then as I started to prepare this presentation, my eyes opened up to forces and information that gave me new insight, which hopefully I'm going to share with you today. But first of all, as Josiah was saying, I am not of your world, so I'm curious more about your world. I really do want to know about your world and the nature of your world, particularly in relationship to who you are, where you come from, and how trauma has been impacting on you. So I do want to hear about those things. And so throughout the presentation, I will be asking questions on that. But I do come in with this lens of background and training within the field of trauma, that as a somatic psychologist, I'm always fascinated what it does to the body, what it does to our nervous systems, and also generationally, how we are in our relational world with trauma. So at any time, like Josiah said, start thinking about these questions that you would like to share, and that throughout the presentation, I'm going to ultimately give us some skills throughout the end to see if you can change your relationship to trauma. That would be my goal. That's what I'm hoping on some level comes out of this presentation today. So we are in a crisis, and trauma and crises have always gone together, and they share a way of impacting our lives in many different ways, particularly in our relational world as well, our sense of ourselves, how we relate to others. And when I hold that, and I pulled this quote, so I'm going to read it to you because I think it articulates the background of how I will be talking to you today. So trauma and the interpreting community, using their traumatic attachment belief scale, interpreters revealed that they generally experience elevated rates of disruption in psychological needs and cognitive schemas compared to normative samples as a measure of vicarious trauma. The data also reveals, and this is how the academic world is researching who you are, where you come from, that interpreters with a trauma history who had a history of mental health diagnoses, who were not certified and who were younger when compared to their counterpart group, experienced highest vicarious trauma. Basically, what this was beginning to tell me, and what I want to articulate to you is, if you are not careful, you will be a very traumatized population through the very nature of your work. And I find that fascinating, given that that is also taking place during the crisis of our times. And again, one of the things that I think COVID is asking of us is to look at our lifestyles, who we are, our sense of ourselves. And it has invited many questions. It has demanded of us how we take care of ourselves, how we organize, how we work, how we play. There are many stresses. So I'm curious, and this is where I would like to invite some of the feedback from you. What might be articulated for you individually, if you were to summarize what crisis has happened for you. For some of you, it's in health. For some of you, it is economic, educational, strains within relationships. So I would be curious if you would start putting into the chat ways in which you're noticing impacts, how it's impacting children, your families. So how has your life been altered? So Josiah, I'm curious if you're hearing from,
Yeah, we have a few responses. So CPS removal of children was one response with mental health impacts associated to that. Loneliness.
Yes.
Let's see. Late onset disability. Another one who says interpreting a job and not knowing the outcome of the situation. So doing the job, interpreting, and then not knowing the outcome of what happens. And maybe if it's, I'm assuming maybe if it's a very intense kind of situation, you interpret there and you're not sure what happened next. So you have no closure, I guess.
Right.
So somebody's talking about spending time with their toxic family.
Yeah. Right. Very interesting, just in hearing some of this, that it's shifted how we've had to cope and how we've had to have our lives, and our sense of how we're watching people suffer, right? People who have been directly impacted. And we're also aware that it's changing our lives too. I can tell you that this came out recently. It's from the World Health Organization. It's in October. So this was a statement about the impact on people's livelihoods, their health, and food systems even. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to a dramatic loss of human life worldwide and presents an unprecedented, as those words again, challenge to public health, food systems, and the world of work. The economic and social disruption caused by the pandemic is devastating. Tens of millions of people are at risk of falling into extreme poverty, while the number of undernourished people are currently estimated at nearly 690 million, could increase by up to 132 million by the end of the year. Millions of enterprises face an existential threat. Nearly half of the world's 3.3 billion global workforce, which is also including you, are at risk of losing their livelihoods. Right? So we are aware that from our education, our sense of community mental health, short-term, long-term consequences for children. Even as one of you said, being in relationship with family members who in different ways may be under different degrees of stress, people are being impacted by this. He says psychological as well as what I've looked at economic, because I think that was the first one that hit people. We're closed down. We can't connect. we will be lonely. And we are a social species too. So the idea that we're being separated by our tribes, our communities, or we're being forced into relationships with people that we might not actually wish to be forced into. So again, from the World Health Organization, research is beginning highlighting the impact on the psychological well-being of the most exposed groups. That includes children, college students, health workers, who are more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and symptoms of distress. The social distance and the security measures have affected relationships amongst people and their perception of empathy towards others. I highlighted this piece because as I started to learn about you as a community, as interpreters, this quality of empathy kept coming up again and again. So I'm going to be talking about that at length shortly. So although it's not possible to predict the duration of the pandemic, we know very well the serious impact of these measures on society, on relationships and interactions, and in particular on the empathic process. So when we think about how, and this is, we saw some of this recently politically too, how instead of being feeling that we were a community being pulled together by an external threat, we were actually being pulled apart. People were not having empathy regarding certain political beliefs. It was a confusion, even in the same households. Should people wear masks? Do I care if you got sick and you didn't? Should I, or somebody gets sick and they did were exposed to you? How do I feel about this? Should we legislate this, legalize it? Some countries are fining people if they gather in their neighbors' houses and backyards. So again, a very different sense of being in community where we're judging, and the strain even within a household because of that process. Empathy, though, is the hallmark of who and what you are as interpreters. And so that this piece is experiencing some challenges, and also how you are working within your virtual world. This is something that came out earlier, prior to the pandemic, that this idea of how we are interfacing with technologies. Now, the good news is, I'm here today talking to you, and there's people from all over America listening to this. And it's wonderful that we are connecting. But at a neurological level, it's not the same as if we were together. I cannot convey certain human experiences to you. And we know that people are getting fatigued by being in the virtual world all the time. School children who are going virtual, a lot of them are finding this very challenging. In fact, for children to be out of school environments and often in home environments that don't have all the resources and facilities, there's been consequences to the COVID virus that we're just beginning to understand in terms of heightened emotional and physical neglect and increases in abuse. But our virtual technical world is with us. COVID has increased our sense of how we're interacting within it as well. So let's talk trauma. Right, given that we're aware that, and I could go on talking about that, we're all under duress, we can all feel it, but it's worth knowing what actually is the nature of trauma. As somebody who studies trauma, works as a clinician with highly traumatized populations, I'm very aware of the dynamics of trauma as opposed to stress. I'm aware when the nervous system is in traumatic reenactment. We have many statistics on how trauma limits people and their worlds and is very detrimental. We actually believe that left to our own devices as a species, we should be able to, we've evolved to actually metabolize trauma, right? We know that zebras get back onto the wild fields after they've been chased by lionesses and don't need to necessarily join a 12-step group, because there's something that neurophysiologically they can adapt, go back and get back into life. Humans are different, and I'll explain a little bit of that shortly, but it's worth actually understanding that in your field, right, and again, this is coming from a study on vicarious trauma, in the field of interpreting, both in spoken and in signed language. Studies on trauma are suggesting that interpreters who work with traumatic content, often more than one time per week and at least once through their lifetime, basically there are studies saying that you are in the world, whether it's children, adolescents, or adults who have a lot of trauma. You are connecting to it at a very deep neurological and emotional level, and it will be impacting you. So first of all, you need to know that when people talk about trauma, and everybody has a way of saying, oh, I'm so traumatized today, I've had a busy day. But actual trauma is more than just having a bad hair day. And although in common vernacular, we do talk about being traumatized, I want you to really understand what trauma is, to recognize it in another, to recognize it in self. And there's basically, for us today, there's three main forms of trauma that I wanted to focus on, because I think that they are the ones that you will either have an intimate experience with within yourself, or you will be engaged in this experience with others. So we broadly define trauma into three categories. We have our one that most people think of, PTSD. That's post-traumatic stress disorder. And then there's our criteria that isn't in our diagnostic manual, although it's recognized within the clinical field. And I personally find this to be the most interesting one: complex trauma, complex PTSD, which I'm going to describe more. And then our vicarious trauma, which, as I've already set the stage for, your profession is the most vulnerable for. So let me just go through the criteria of PTSD so that you get a sense of recognition. So first of all, this is how we understand it. You actually have had to have had an exposure to an actual or threatened death, right? Something in your nervous system experience something life-threatening, either to yourself or a loved one, to an extent that you are very mobilized at the deepest level of your autonomic nervous system. That's that part of you that goes into fight, fright, or into that belief of this is so overwhelming, there's a dissociative tendency too. So there are many, many forms of that, from our violence that is in the world through crime, sexual accidents, even disasters. right? Tornadoes, earthquakes, right? This is the world of when bad things happen to good people. Criteria B, you also have to have a sense of that even after this event, because you've survived it, you did survive, after the event, no matter what, it's still in your world in a way that's very intrusive. These will be either through thoughts, images, memories, and they will be happening in random times that often you cannot control. They hijack, they take over the nervous system. So then it would make sense, and this is the next criteria clinicians look to, there's going to be an avoidance of any of that type of stimulus, right? Or even talking about it. This is where our body colludes with a lot of defense mechanisms and our minds. We can even not remember it. There's different levels of memory that on one level we may have what we call very explicit memories about trauma. And we can remember the exact date, what time, what we were wearing. So if that is imprinted in a hologram within us forever. And other times we only have a sense of the memory because the level of biochemical stress, cortisol, that happens throughout the body and brain can create amnesia. So we may have a felt memory of what that type of experience was. That's often common in childhood when the brain isn't fully mature enough to hold a lot of memory. Remember, it takes about up to 7 years for the development of the child's brain for them to actually come out of the years of magical thinking and where reality and magical beliefs start to shift. So children then start, well, wait a minute, I do remember that. Prior to that, even before languaging, we have these pre-verbal or somatic senses of what's happened. All of this goes into our mood, our sense then of how our nervous system can even regulate our sense of who we are, because the lion's share now of regulation is taking to this management of unbearable neurological energy going through the body. We're either wired into a vigilance or we are wired into an affect that we lost. There's a depression in the nervous system that for whatever reason we cannot figure out, we cannot talk our way out of feeling better. Some part of our brain doesn't know that we survived. We have all the cognitions that go along with this, because our mind is trying to figure out what our neurology is telling us. And so the thoughts can be, I'm bad. Right? The world is completely dangerous. Some part of us will know that it's our thoughts are no longer rational. We'll be like, I'm no longer there. I'm not at the scene of the crime. But there's other parts of our brain that are telling us, actually, we really are. We're still there. We have parts of our brain that are outside of time-space. And although this lecture today is not about the neurology of trauma, but we do know that our brainstem that organizes around the autonomic nervous system of fight and flight, and our limbic brain that organizes deep imprints of who we are in the world and what's safe and what is not, will often stay connected to a traumatic event and be organizing that material at some metabolic chemical level, even if our mind is saying, I'm okay. And that is actually the most interesting phenomenon of trauma for us, right? Even if we survive, some part of our brain is not congruent in time-space, right? The resolution of trauma for me is that in time-space, in present time, there's a congruency not only in my brain and all parts of my brain, from my brainstem, my limbic brain, my prefrontal cortex, the three main parts of my brain know that I'm here and I'm safe. And then my body gets to enjoy coming along for the ride. My breath, how my heartbeat is, right? That's embodiment, which I'm going to go on to talk about is very key also, along with this empathy in who you are as a particular profession. But this other criteria is in the body. The alteration in arousal and reactivity. This is where, for some of you, if you've ever heard a door bang and you have a startle reflex, right? There's a reactivity, which, by the way, is exhausting. That we may stay scared on some level in our brain all the time is exhausting. It's also why most people have a degree of depression when they have unresolved trauma. And if you go back to some of the criteria that I've just shown you, the other thing that's interesting about trauma is we may have some traumatic resolution on some aspects, but on other aspects of trauma, we may not be so resolved. So we could actually have a resolution about our belief systems, about who we are in the world, but we still don't feel safe when we go to bed at night. So you can see here across the board as a clinician, when I'm first encountering somebody with trauma, I'm looking at those criteria because trauma comes in very individually for people. So there's that intrusiveness, there's the avoidance, there's my changing my beliefs about myself and my mood, my emotions. And that's all landing in the body with that degree of arousal and my reactivity. Some of these criteria you may be noticing and saying, I understand that. Right. Some of you may have had experiences in the world that you know changed you. Well, you actually do know that trauma can go on to give us greater resilience and meaning making, right, if we survive it. Right? So if there's any questions around this aspect so that we really get a sense of this, because often people think of trauma as, oh, I should have been over that. It happened years ago. Why am I being so weak? Why am I believing that was so bad when I've really heard about things happening to other people? Surely my trauma can't be as bad as somebody else's. So often there's quite a lot of confusion about the nature of trauma, when actually the very traumatized person is trying to deal with it within themselves. So if anybody does have any questions about the criteria here, Josiah, this will be another good time for me to answer any questions on that.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and type those into the chat box, and I'll interpret them from text to spoken English. The question here, what defines trauma? From Kate.
I would say, outside of the medical definition that I've just given you, Kate, I would actually say it's where your nervous system isn't regulated into time-space, meaning right now, in which you're living your life free from an event that some part of you thought nearly killed you, or it was unable to resolve. And there's an interesting, if you think about trauma across the developmental span of life, if you were, for example, to, this is an example I give to some of my clients, if you put a baby in a very, very, very cold room, given its internal and external resources and neurological ability, that would most probably be life-threatening. If you put a 6-year-old in that same very cold room, they will be able to curl up and maintain body heat and warmth so they wouldn't die. If you put a 16 in the same event, same very cold room, they will be able to figure out and perhaps find a way out. And if you put a 26 there, they wouldn't even have gone into the room in the first place. Right? So trauma hits us differently regarding the age, our internal resources, and where we are, right, within ourselves. For example, trauma also hits us through different boundary systems. Our physical boundary system, we could break a leg, right? We trip, we fall over, that's a traumatic event. Not life-threatening, but it might be. If I fall down and nobody helps me, it could kill me. That's emotional trauma, right? Right? And people are like, well, that's, if you think of our language, he stabbed me in the heart, right? We literally have languaging that conveys traumatic experiences around being told, oh, by the way, I just betrayed you, right? And then there's mental psychological variations of where trauma comes into us, right? We're just always told we're stupid, right? We're not allowed to have our thought processes. In fact, throughout the world, if you talk to political prisoners, and they will say, well, I'm incarcerated because I have a different political view and I'm being tortured. Like the intellectual traumas. Then there's the sexual traumas that come in. Then there's the spiritual, religious. So the 5 boundaries of who we are. And if you think even of my hand gesture now, right, if I know that these all represent my boundaries of self, the most common boundary gesture to maintain safety is that gesture. It can't get in, right? But trauma, by definition, very simply, is the breach of that. Right? It did get in. It overwhelmed my capacity, either physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, sexually, or all of the above.
And a nice follow-up to that, Dr. Barnum, we have a question about trauma and if it can be presented through anxiety as well as depression.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're very, what we call co-occurring, right? And often you as a clinician, I have to really kind of like discern that depression isn't trauma and trauma isn't depression, although they come together, right? And anxiety, if left unattended, right, which is basically fear spread thin, starts to cue the autonomic nervous system so that when an event might hit us, I'm already scared. My nervous system doesn't know that I could actually be safe in the world, which is a basic somatic and neurological right to have for all of us, that we walk on the earth safely. Now that's a journey for all of us, right? To take our right to live on the earth, regardless of ethnicity, gender, orientation, ability, right, of who and what we are. And trauma is a very interesting phenomena that will always challenge that in any of those 5 domains. Right?
And I'm going to read out one more question, Dr. Barnum, and then let you continue here. But there was a question asking, why are some people better able to deal with trauma than others?
Oh, I love that question. I really do love that question, because that really is, if we understood the mechanisms, right, of what happens around people within traumatic experiences, we would also understand the reparative process. We begin to speculate, and I think that this is the reality about trauma. if you have, so I'm going to say it in a very general way, and then I'm going to go into it a little bit more deeply in a minute and explain what we believe. But basically, as a species, if we grow up in home environments in which at an emotional, affective, neurological level, we feel safe and have what we call secure attachment, as a species, we can organize around resilience, sense of safety, and we can regulate who we are to have flexibility and capacity at a higher level to process the world coming at us and how we respond. If I'm so this does take us into the next criteria that I'm going to be showing you, which is complex PTSD, which is the interpersonal version of trauma, which we understand is particularly relevant to the developing brain from in utero, postpartum, and particularly in the first critical developmental stages of the very mechanisms within our neurology to process trauma. So I could answer your question in this basic way. If I was traumatized as a child, and if I'm not so securely attached to the relational world that should have kept me safe, I'm at higher level of traumatic vulnerability. We see that across the board, right? I've got a slide up showing that level of arousal that we understand shifts what we call a window of tolerance. If I've got a good window of tolerance, I can take stimulus and I can resolve it. I'm not just wired all the time or in flat affect all the time. So I don't have the brake on, I don't have my foot on the brake if I was a car all the time, really, or the foot on the accelerator, right? I'm able to really handle the external stimulus coming to me, process it, and then reset. Here would be another way of thinking about trauma. You can't reset back to safety again. So you can see all of the way that trauma can take us all into its flat affect, which is like not able to have the vitality. It's almost as if the body said, the predator is still there, so I better just shut down. Right? Because we know predators like to have moving objects. So it's like this evolutionary remnant of survival. On another level, we can see some people are just scared. It's like the little rabbit just always shaking. And other people have the deer in the headlight. Right? And they're organizing the rest of their neurology and their emotional world around that, which fascinates me because as interpreters, you've got to pick that up. You're organizing the material of your translation, also aware from your clients that may have that level of what we call affect, or which is just emotion in the nervous system, as part of your profession. So as I move forward, I wanted to acknowledge how the body does keep score. Right? Keeps the score from our childhood. It basically, I could say this again, it's how you may often be wired. Right? And that traumatic memory experience has a neurological signature, as I've been trying to articulate, but it also has a somatic signature too. And this can be very important to this phenomenon that we're seeing with young children. complex post-traumatic stress disorder, by the way, and this always fascinates my graduate students when I spend a lot of time talking about this. We actually didn't have a term for this until the 1990s. And you know, I am getting old a bit, but it fascinates me that it's taking us this long as a community to start to articulate, well, yes, we know what you know, how bad things happen to good people, but what about when bad childhoods happen to good children? And the idea that this phenomenon of early childhood neglect and abuse would actually continue and set the trajectory for the whole neurological and emotional development of children, and started to be articulated and studied more in the 1990s, in part for when we were looking at the neglect of children from orphanages and noticing what severe neglect and attachment breach was happening. So this became and opened up a phenomenon of, oh, well, trauma isn't just because you are in a car accident or are in a war or even in domestic violence, but there's another level of interpersonal violence that is critical when we are developing interpersonal skills and the neurology to grow the brain even more, to actually regulate relationally, again, self and with other. So complex post-traumatic stress disorder is the phenomenon of the attachment disruptions that are now at a level that the child is unable to self-regulate or be guided into a regulatory world because the environment around them isn't able to provide that. So this is the world of the chronic sexual, psychological, physical abuse, neglect, children growing up in violence, victims of workplace or where children are in school bullying, or their parents are using substance. So when we began to see the long-term effects of this, one of the ways we study it and we articulate it is under the term now of adverse childhood experiences. And some of you may be familiar with that. The educational psychologists were waiting for this, as well as the developmental psychologists. We now can see the longitudinal studies that children growing up go on in their 40s and 50s to actually have physiological, psychological, economic, all of the lifestyles of the nervous system saying, I never recovered. So it's when I think of this variation of trauma, it is the long-term impact on the development of the very mechanism of who we are as a species, our social relational brain. We're not reptiles. We want to have social relational skills so that our trust of self, our trust of other feels good, right? So we can see the way it reverses development. So we have neurology, we have the child growing, so that the focus, instead of I grow out of different stages of my brain to go into more, as you can see, with typical development, my cognition and my social emotional engage me. These are the people who are more resilient to traumas and the slings of and arrows of just everyday stress and life. These are the people right now who have figured out that COVID, they'll survive it, they won't like it, But they're going to adapt. They're going to actually figure out how to stay connected. They'll work it through. They can regulate. They're not caught up just in survival. If you look at the developmental trauma, the world is still in survival. Why would I bother to learn poetry or Shakespeare or calculus, algebra, even school? I'm trying to survive. I can't self-regulate. My sense of my social, emotional, and my cognition, my prefrontal cortex that has that executive functioning is being compromised. It's not safe to grow that brain. And in the long term, the longitudinal, this is the gift that unfortunately keeps on giving for some family systems, and where intergenerational trauma plays its part, right? So I'm not securely attached. I'm not looking for love in all the wrong places. I don't even know what that is. I'm just looking for trauma in all the wrong places. So how do I then take care of my own children, right? The generational aspect of this that goes on and on in the body as the stresses. And so we can see how it shows up in that disrupted neurological development, the social, in how I even know how to take care of myself, my vulnerability to substance use disorders, how I will have more incidences of diseases, disability, social problems, and I will actually die early. One of our concerns is the exacerbation of COVID within this population as well. So this is always worth asking, right, ourselves. So what is the primary difference between PTSD and complex PTSD? Because you can actually have both. Right? Just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, you can actually have both. Complex PTSD will always be relational. You can be walking down the road and break your leg, as I mentioned earlier. That is traumatic. Take a moment and sense what it would feel like for you if you knew that somebody had deliberately pushed you, and that's how you broke your leg. And actually, they were somebody you thought cared for you. Or the person who should have actually helped you with your broken leg didn't care. Your trauma will not be the repair of your bone in your leg. Your trauma will be the long-term impact of what that person did or didn't do to you. And that's why we're most uniquely vulnerable as a species, the relational trauma. Again, if you go back to that child's brain, 700 neural connections per second in the first 3 years. And all of that needs to be taking place in safety, because if there's neglect, and this is a image of one of the slides of what we understood the neglect was due to children from the orphanages. The brain can't even grow to self-regulate. It's not going to be able to handle. And if you look into where language, sensory pathways, the vision, the hearing, if you look at the time frame from conception to birth, age in months as well, age in years, you disrupt that with trauma at a deep relational level. How am I going to take in and trust? Some of these will be your clients who have grown up, who you're working with. Some of them are in your profession. Some of you have variations of trauma that as we enter into this unique level of trauma, which is vicarious trauma, are all going to start coming together. Again, Josiah, any other questions around that differentiation between PTSD and complex PTSD? I'm more than willing to answer here.
I don't see any questions related to the difference between those two specifically. I do have a comment from Allison about just how interesting it is from the perspective of language deprivation. So when you're talking about the neglect brain, early development, not having access to language, how that impacts the brain. So, for interpreters, that's always going to be particularly interesting, considering we work with language and the accessibility of language, communication, things like that. So can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit, the language piece, and how maybe that might be particularly applicable to the work of interpreters, especially maybe interpreters working maybe with young populations, deaf children in schools, things like that.
I'm hypothesized. Well, this I do know. Language gives us a sense of the world, even in our vision. Right? If I can't name it, I can't know it. Right? It's kind of like how I've always understood that it's the brain that hears. Right? It's not the ear, it's the brain that we have to organize vibration, sound, to ultimately have meaning making, so that then we can know it at a deeper level, to speak it, to sound it, to get a sense of what it is. And that's the world of phenomenology. Right? Again, a little bit out of the scope of this world today, but if I'm a child that in critical developmental stages of my brain's growth, so again, I'll go back into that slide there, right? And look, this is in months. So that I've got a world in which I'm neglected as an infant. My brain will not be safe enough to actually go into neuronal expansion to actually start identifying sound, because I will be more organized into a more primitive part of my brain. I will not be developing the neural structure that is necessary for me to hear, give voice, to also understand the meaning. My richness of my emotional self, even my ability to tell you how I am feeling, right? This we call mentalization. It's a particular field of study in which I know what you're feeling too, because I can identify it and tell you and give voice to it. So that the neglected, abused child can often not even tell you their world, because they can't actually give voice to it, but it's still happening at an effective level. When I say effective, again, that is how the nervous system is holding our emotional energy, right? We think of the emotion of fear, right? We say it's an emotion, but at a neurological level, it's got a universal signature across the board. I just might say to you, I'm emotionally scared this much. Somebody else could say, oh, I'm emotionally scared that much. So our interpretation of it subjectively may be differently, right? And some of us could give voice to it better than other, right? So I would speculate that early neglect and abuse disrupts the capacity for us to have that felt sense of self at an emotional level that I could articulate, not only to other, but even to me, right? That I know what I'm feeling.
And Dr. Barnum, thank you. That is what a significant point about being able to voice your fears, and maybe the inability to do that if you are language deprived. There were a couple of comments I just wanted to mention that were along that same point. And one was that we also work as interpreters with adults who were language deprived as children, who may have had linguistic or cognitive issues because of that deprivation. And then an addition from Jennifer saying also social. We work with people who may have had social gaps because of a variety of reasons of growing up in a communication classroom, where you're placed in the classroom, or which classrooms you're placed in for deaf students, things like that. So yes, good point. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that we work with adult populations that have those.
Totally makes sense. It really does make sense. And again, I'm being very generalized here, but I believe our brain evolved to actually know that it could connect, that it wants to connect. It's a mammalian brain right now. And it's saying to us, being connected, whatever way we do it, is what gives us a sense of self. So that I'm seen, I'm known, I'm heard by other. Trauma is the disruptor of that deep connection with self and other, because I'm in a part of my world that is survival based, right? Survival doesn't care so much about connection. It brings down our empathy. It stops us from knowing our embodied self, right? And in the most extreme of the traumas, we will go sociopathic. Most of us, though, deal with the range of, we know we're hurting. We still feel it. We still feel the wound that we can't connect to other, right? We haven't shut off the parts of our brain. So as I go into this phenomenon of what vicarious trauma is, and given that as the beginning of this presentation, I named that the interpreting community is very vulnerable to vicarious trauma, I wanted to give us this languaging around, well, how do we understand what is vicarious trauma? So it's got a couple of terms, and you might hear it interchangeably. But indirect trauma, it's a form of trauma that can occur when we are exposed to difficult or disturbing images, narratives, stories at this second-hand level. Okay. Well, from what I understand from the contemporary literature, this is the world that many of you are in. You are being exposed to difficult and disturbing images, secondhand, but you're also needing the capacity to translate that. So we go into your reality. Sign language interpreting is an occupation that suffers from high levels of repetitive motion injuries. That I didn't know until I was preparing for this presentation. And burnout, which is a common vernacular for vicarious trauma, due to the high physical and cognitive demands that you face. So this was a question that kept on coming up to me as I was looking into this intersection of different traumas and your role. So I wanted to ask you, I was open to, again, this being a time to dialogue here. What is your role? Because at a neurological level, you are in an interpersonal, neurological, biological exchange with information that's coming to you from often people with trauma, not everybody, translating it through what might be aspects of your own unmetabolized trauma into a world that has trauma, whether it's children, adolescents, adults. And so this image that I started to form of your community, albeit from a naive outsider point of view, was a constant exchange of information, not just the information at the superficial level, right? Like what I'm telling you, right? But at the deeper level. So I'm curious. I want to hear at this stage, Josiah, how people are holding their sense of their role in their profession. What's happening to your brain? Are you aware what's going on in your nervous system, your central nervous system, and this autonomic nervous system, what I've described very briefly in that fight or flight or freeze mechanism? So any questions on that? Love the chat, by the way. A lot of stuff coming through. If I had better vision and eyesight, I could read it in time, you know.
So yeah, a couple of comments, and I'm going to add a couple of my own thoughts as well. One comment from Carol says that we take on the persona of the people that we interpret for, which Dr. Barnum, in our meetings before this presentation, we talked about the idea of embodiment, and so I think that's what that's speaking to, is the fact that as interpreters, we oftentimes do take on, the feelings, the intentions of the people we're interpreting for. It's part of the role of the interpreter, because it makes the message more, hopefully, closely aligned with the speaker, right? And so we are always presenting ourselves in this way to each person or the people that we're interpreting for. So that's Carol's comment on that side. I did want to just and then you, of course, add anything about that you'd like, Dr. Barnum. You asked the question, what's happening in our minds while we're interpreting? And that's a great question. And the thing is right now, we're still trying to find that out. So in terms of research that's looking specifically at interpreters and what's happening in the brain, I mean, there isn't a lot out there right now that looks specifically at the neurology. So it's a developing schema that we don't yet have. Some people are looking into it. I do know today we have a couple of researchers on the call. If you want to add your thoughts, please feel free to do that in the chat. So just a short kind of opinion that or thought that we don't have a lot of information right now, but it's something that right now we're becoming increasingly interested in on the academic level, is looking at what interpreters are doing while they're doing their work of interpreting what's happening in their brains, what's happening emotionally. So we're still collecting that data.
Well, mate, I totally concur. And actually, I'm looking at, I'm really thinking like, wow, I did a good job with that slide on empathy, because that was my sense, actually, that there's an exchange happening that is asking of you at a bioneurological level to be engaged, that I think is very different. It's kind of like, it's running more intensely than what I might believe I'm doing when I talk to somebody without sign. That you're asking your central nervous system, you're asking your neurology to carry extra information, right, that may not normally be demanded of us to have conventional, if that's the right way for me to frame it, empathic responses as to who we are as a social animal and how we want to engage. The nonverbal languages, the way that we know things, we're cueing things through our senses. So my imagination of you as a community is that you are you're the Jedi of the social engagement, right? You are the masters of developing the neurology to this field of what I wanted to bring in, which is empathy. And it's an interesting world too, that I do actually have some slides showing what we think brains look like in empathic process. But in your basic level, in what you are being asked, is this emotional narrative that's needing to come along with the narrative at a social engaged level. Now we know we've got our basic emotions that researchers cross-culturally and universally hold. We measure it in levels of arousal or intensity. And we do know that in the West, we like our arousal levels of our affect to be a little bit higher than what we call the constraint. If we were in the East, then we can often see this in photographs, like we would see an American politician saying, "Hey, trust me," with a really big, wide grin. And in Asia, we might see that same measure with the smile not being quite so elaborate for our eyes. So we're looking at how emotions and affect and our actual neurology, even throughout the genders, how they can be different. And again, we are aware of those basic emotions, but think of all the languages, all the feeling tones that come out of those primary emotions, and the subjectivity that would then go through facial expression. Again, a lot of this is universal, particularly with the basic ones like disgust. We believe, for example, is so universal because it's going to keep you alive. If it smells bad, feels bad, it could be dangerous. It could kill us. So disgust and surprise and anger, these universal, because they're biological shortcuts of survival. Right? So then when we start to think about empathy, and this goes into, Josiah, what you were talking about, where people are looking at, well, okay, we've got these mirror neurons, and we've got part of the sensory motor strip in the brain. So I'm seeing an action, and then part of my brain will go into simulation. And this is how we learn. And then from that, I can make my imitation. I can do a hand gesture. This may be actually interested in another piece, and that I'm clumsy with my language on this. I was like, this is fascinating. In your world, you even have to learn another language to interpret a language at this deep level of empathic resonance and embodiment. How do you even teach this? You have to use in your teaching pedagogy, you even have to figure out how you teach this with the same process. So you've got a process within a process, if that makes sense. So by the time I would imagine that when we think about how we empathize, we watch, we have to memorize this. I'm again impressed how you would learn your skills, let alone in your active work environment, how this is being conveyed. So some of the neurobiology here that's involved, we know that if I'm in pain, this is what it might look like in my brain. That if I've got to actually translate a message, or if I'm aware that other is in pain, this is fascinating. Look, it's even more areas of my brain are coming into resonance and lighting up. So facets of this empathy, this learning to train to get this profession right that you're in, you're taking advantage of neuroplasticity, what we call neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain at the synaptic level to create connections, deepen those connections at a dendritic level, and then actually memorize, work from that. So again, I know today's presentation a little bit out of the scope of the neurology of this, but if we start to now build in this narrative that here you are, you're a profession, you're more vulnerable to trauma. You have your own versions of trauma, perhaps from your childhoods or from your life experiences, and that you're now empathically mediating at an embodied level between your clients, right, who you are serving, who you are advocating for. So it brought me to this question as to what actually is happening in the body as well. So you ask what is happening in your brain, and also what is happening in the body, all of the systems, musculoskeletal, right, endocrinological, right, your respiratory, digestive. Because if you are being asked to come into persona, I'm asking, whose persona and how do you get back to your own? How are you going to actually stay in alignment within your own embodiment process? I am actually curious about how you experience embodiment. This is a very, by the way, this issue of embodiment, this is hugely philosophical as much as neurological. It may even go into the realms of theology, right? But it certainly is inviting us to reframe for you that mind-body, that sense of a dualistic split that we've been living under since Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. Well, in somatic psychology, we have always said, well, I have a felt sense, therefore I am. And now your profession is demanding, how could I say it? I have to carry your felt sense as well, therefore I am. And when I imagine, again, that within your felt sense, right, not only of yourself, but other, that we will have this issue of the signature of trauma, right? This signature running in our nervous system, that frequency, as it were. So this might be another nice place. I'm curious what people think. What is embodiment, right? If you are being asked of this concept of this is part of your work that you have to have a persona too, right? I would like to, I want to hear more. I'm curious from you about this.
Dr. Barnum, there's a comment relevant to this point from Danielle Hunt about embodiment and why it might lead to burnout with interpreters. So one aspect of our work as interpreters is using the first person, like saying, I did this, I feel this. And even using those terms, whether we're speaking or signing, is so different. This is Danielle, Dr. Hunt's point, is so different than
Got it.
She did this or he did this. So, and a lot of people who aren't familiar with the work of interpreters, they may think interpreters relay information by saying, he just said he'll be there at 2:00. But that's not accurate. We mostly use the first person. So thoughts on that as a contribution to why, what embodiment might be for us and how we experience it?
Absolutely. You're asking yourself to actually not be there in that moment, right? And that this other phenomenon that we're studying too called empathic contagion. It sounds worse than COVID, doesn't it? But empathic contagion is that my brain will actually start to hold an emotional resonance where it will be, I can't differentiate it from you or from me. For example, this is a kind of a silly example, but have you ever been around somebody who's yawned? They start to yawn, And then the next thing you know, you're yawning, right? Well, whose yawn is it? You were fine until they started to yawn. But now everything in your neurology is making you yawn. You could actually do this with laughter too. Do you ever started to laugh? You don't even know what you're laughing about. Right? Somebody started to laugh, and you're all of a sudden, there's this contagion, there's blurring. Right? Now, I don't actually think, but necessarily this is bad. I think nature set this up to say, look, we're the same tribe. We come from the same tribe. This is how we do it. We share, we're intimate. It's not a codependent distortion, right? That we now attune so deeply. We can blur a bit. Couples do this. After a while, they're not claiming to be telepathic, but they know what the other person may need or what they want. Mothers have to do this for the attunement and survival of their child. Although mothers don't often know how to do it initially, babies teach mothers, mothers teach babies. There's that dyadic exchange. That is the hallmark of attachment. But I would actually say, or challenge or speculate, I'm not too sure of the word here, when you are with your client and you are speaking on their the I, as for the I of other, you are in an attachment experience that neurophysiologically self and other are coming into a very intimate experience, right? Where we can often lose self. So I find this fascinating on this journey, and I'm open to any other speculations on this.
Yeah, and the sense of self, the sense of self is recurring in a couple different statements or questions here in the chat box. The death of ego, as we're interpreting, realizing it's not me. They're not mad at me, they're mad at the person I'm interpreting for.
Right.
It's not about me. But it's. I mean, speaking as a practitioner myself, it can be hard to actually do that, and you're supposed to. Cognitively, we're taught that. Okay, let go of this, let go of the phone call, let go of the situation. It's not about you. But it feels like it is sometimes, especially when people start having elevated emotions, negative emotions, and feeling like, oh man, I'm in the middle of this,
Well, you are. I'm just going to name that. You absolutely are in the middle of it in a way that's unprecedented for who we are as a species. This is a kind of like a nice confirmation, so just so that some of you don't think you're like the only ones feeling some of this. I mean, when I started to pull up some literature, and I know that you're also telling me that studies are lacking, but I was, you are being asked at a level using the human body to create pictures of the human soul. Oh my goodness, no pressure there, guys, right? So that you're this emotional congruence, this sense of understanding other and self, and getting rid of your own egos, or however it's been asked of you. This is in a theatre format. But I wanted to show you from studies, and these are pretty contemporary, what we're beginning to believe what the emotional map would look like in the body that you're translating. Now, I think you'll find this interesting. So again, given that you're in between and your role is to be so accurate as to what you convey. So a person, when we see sadness, these are levels of heat activation and areas of the body that are metabolizing and moving. This anger, fear, disgust, depression. So if you're embodying on behalf of both of clients or either side of you, your body will have to actually start feeling, responding neurophysiologically to this. At all ages too. Right? You're going to feel it. You're going to know this. You are being trained at the deepest level of communication. So this just brings me to a position, I think, and you were alluding to it, Josiah. What is the position you're in then?
I think a good starting point for talking about position is, first of all, recognizing we have different levels of position. So we have our position culturally, our position in terms of being a working professional. We have our position also in the communication event itself. And there is conversation in interpreting and interpreter education about role space. So what role do you take in what space that you're in? And flexibility with role, again, contingent on the space and your role in that space. But I would say, this is just me speaking, that an essential part of a working interpreter is understanding that. Why am I here in this communication event? There are models of the role of the interpreter that have been used in interpreting and interpreting training for many years. And I won't go through all of them for the sake of time, but I'll just touch on the extremes of these different roles. So one role of the interpreter being akin to a conduit. So just like an electrical wire that we get information and give information back and forth. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum, something that's referred to as a bilingual and bicultural mediator. And the implications of that role would be an understanding of the cultural elements and dynamics that impact the interpreting task at hand, and our ability to really properly interpret starts with our ability to understand. And we can't understand if we don't know something about the culture of the people that we're interpreting for, or we can, but it may not be as effective, right? So I think in terms of role, that's a good starting point, but definitely looking for some comments here in the chat to see if people have thoughts on that.
And I really appreciate you giving me these terms and insight into your world too. And I like what this word of conduit. That makes sense to me. And I also have I'm learning with great appreciation your cultural awareness and culture on all levels of how you are aware of the culture of so many, the micro, the macro cultures, that social levels that we're aware of these days. So I really, really appreciate that in you.
Absolutely. And I want to mention, you may have this article on your slide deck, I don't remember, but there was some work done back in 2015 by Elaine C. and Brendan Nicodemus on conceptualizing emotions. And this was specifically for healthcare interpreters. And just some relevant points here to some things you've already been talking about. They basically did a literature review of what the literature looks like for not only interpreters, but in psychology, vicarious trauma, dealing with emotions as a professional when you're working with other people. And just kind of calling back to some points that you made, they had some significant findings, such as just what the role of empathy has in the work of interpreting, and that struggle of what I was just talking about between where you find the ability to detach from the people you're interpreting for in order to maintain your own sense of self and care for yourself, while at the same time, with interpreters, there may be some heightened attachment, whether intentionally or not intentionally, and sometimes it's for the sake of doing the work of interpreting. So in order to understand the person you're interpreting for, you're trying to see how are they trying to present themselves, him or herself, to the other person or other people. Taking that on to myself, for me, feels like I can do a better job interpreting if I can understand or try to understand their ego or their intent. Now, the efficacy of us being able to do that, questionable, but sometimes we try to do that in order to interpret better. So then we're constantly in this tension between association and disassociation, association.
Yes. That makes so much sense. I really, again, thank you so much in how you you're educating me about this incredible process that I believe you are all working with, and my respect every time I for what you do as I'm learning this it's growing, it's incredible. So in my clumsy way, my sense of you is, and you're somehow in the middle. Right? You're in the middle of different realities. You're in the middle of different relationships. You're in the middle. And because of the psychologist in me and the capacity for somebody to put yourself into your vigorous trainings, you're asking of yourself to associate, dissociate, to whole persona, not, but where you've been asking of yourself, lends me to think in terms of, it had to be familiar to you on some level growing up. Your capacity to even say, I'm prepared to step into that one.
Dr. Barnum, could we do a little just, not exactly data gathering scientifically, but can we poll people?
Yes, that would be.
This was something particularly interesting, Dr. Barnum, because you asked me about this before your presentation about interpreters tending maybe toward taking a mediator role or a middle role in their upbringing or their families of origin. And for me, that was absolutely true. I was a mediator growing up with my family members well before I ever knew about interpreting or anything about interpreting. So I'd be curious to know on this point, those who are engaged still and involved here with the chat, did you have that experience growing up where you already had a tendency toward being a mediator before becoming an interpreter?
It's a really brilliant question to ask, Josiah, because often we don't realize that some of our ways of who we are in the world is an adaptation around trauma, and it's become our strength. And that the child says, don't worry, mommy, don't worry, daddy, I'll figure it out for you both. I'll be the peacekeeper, I'll be the parent, I'll hold the unresolved of my parents, my family system. I've got a big enough nervous system to translate. And sometimes the translation is simply, go tell your dad, right? Or make sure your mom knows this, right? The kids who's in the constant conflict, perhaps even of a divorce. Or just the child who knows that unless they're between their parents, right? Mommy's not safe, daddy's not safe. Or they carry that weight to make sure that mom and dad don't have to focus on themselves. They play a role. So I don't know, Josiah, if you can see poll stuff.
There are, it was just in the chat box, but lots of yeses, a few no's, some people saying I was a fixer, people pleaser, overly empathic. But a surprising amount of yeses, or maybe not surprising, but a lot of yeses.
Well, when we come clean, as it were, on our of that we've been able to turn something that our nervous system holds a degree of familiarity with, and we've organized it into a strength of who we are in life, right? That's not a bad thing. We just have to make sure that our nervous systems are not still caught up with that on some level, adding to our own unresolved early complex trauma, or it's making us more vulnerable to loss of self and ways in which we may not know how to come back in a more meaningful way, right? To find our own embodiment. Again, you alluded to some of the studies here around how stressful this can be to people, that you're prepared. I was just so struck that in this familiarity that I can see from the chat too, that most of you're hanging out here like Marines, It's like this is all powerful course. It's what you go through your childhood. What's your boot camp training at some level, right? Because the demand that's being made on you. And you're prepared to self-sacrifice like any good child. It's good for them, but not so much for me. And that was the citation that you were organizing around too, right? These challenges that on some level, I believe you're used to. And here's what's so fascinating. And we do know this about children often who grow up in environments where they're in that role. Boy, you better do it perfectly. Stakes are really high. Maybe if I don't tell daddy or mommy the right thing or in the right way, somebody's going to get into trouble, or my mom or my dad. There's a parenting of other capacity here. So the nervous system really had to stretch to be bigger than, right? So we're going to be very conscientious. We're going to have a lot of what we call perfectionistic traits. That's not allowing us just to be good enough. Good enough is a term we use in attachment literature when children are securely attached. They know that they can actually be okay. Children who actually don't have safety within their felt sense of self will actually compensate by often trying and trying and trying, right? So it becomes very interesting, this whole sense of that. Stress is going to be there along with you in your work, and how you're going to have to figure out coping mechanisms around that. Again, look at you guys, what you're used to dealing with in your burnout. It's not just psychologically, it's coming in physically, but this is letting me know something about how you're prepared to use your body on behalf of other. And then from a dissertation, very contemporary, you are dealing with the traumatic content that may not even be your own, from your own childhood. I quoted that earlier. So what would be this toll, right? So now we've got COVID. So we've got this world that has reminded us we're in unprecedented times. But I actually think as a profession, you've been dealing with this prior to COVID. COVID might have given us the opportunity to finally articulate that you will be having various emotional contagion. You've got the vicariousness of this life, this trauma. You're in the conflict often between two environments. So what is the question that I become very curious with? How do I hold on to my own embodiment and resolution of my own life's experiences? Well, so much of my time has asked me to provide a degree of connection to somebody else's life, their meaning making, their experience. I think this is our question of how this world of who you are as embodied interpreters. I was trying to pull a question that I would be able to work with you to come up with some resources. Because you're even being told this in your community. You're going to have to deal with this on some level. Right? Data suggests that interpreter training programs should engage in increasing your training in working with trauma, particularly as trauma survivors. A lot of psychosocial education about trauma, some of which I hope I've given you today, just a little bit. And how you would understand developing in more healthier coping strategies, right? So with or without COVID, your world is going to be asking you of this. And this is something even outside of, when I talk to people and they're like, give us a talk on self-care and all of this. Well, for you people, I was like, well, hold on a minute. You're most probably intelligent enough to realize that you do have to take care of what you eat, how you sleep, how you exercise. But then I was like, but there has to be a self to start creating coping strategies to have self-care. And if we're understanding that some of your world of being in the middle and how your empathic nature neurophysiologically is blurring self with other, and the embodiment blurs self with other, I really wanted to draw us, particularly as we're closing this presentation, into looking into the world of somatic resources and ways to come home to self. So there's lots of literature, lots of ways. And when I teach on trauma, we go into self-regulation. We go into finding the container again of the body after the body, as we know, is keeping a traumatic score, right? And also from our PTSD, complex PTSD, and our vicarious trauma, our three ways that we're being wired, right? So I'm going to take the remaining few minutes to do some experiential exercises with you, if you will be willing to do that with me. I'll teach you these so that these may actually be very, very easy, very doable. If there's any other questions before I go into showing some of these resources or any comments, this might be another time to do so.
We don't have anything yet that's pressing and relevant to some of your more recent points. So I think now's the time to move. Yeah, go ahead.
Excellent. So we really want to start becoming the container of our own experience in life. So in a sense of how we come back, there's a couple of ways we can do it. So I'm going to show you and demonstrate. The one that I'm fascinated with, and one that I show a lot of my clients, and interestingly, and I'm always trying to anecdotally track this, my folks who are on the autistic spectrum scale, who have that disability, often they will tell me there's just so much neurology, so much taking place, so much like their brain is so overactive. So one of the things that I show them, and I want to teach you this, because I think you will end up with an overactive mirror neuron and empathic part. I almost want to put a cap on it. So I want you to take the palm of your hand, the kind of like the ridgy area there, and the gap, the area just beneath the fingers there, and find a way. It takes a while for you to get the kinesthetic sense of this, but place it on your forehead as if you could lean your head into something. Something was there, fingertips there, and closing your eyes, right? And then take your remaining hand and find where you wish to place it, whether it would be on your chest, or whether your hand needs to be lower down, right, around the belly area. Your body will tell you, believe me. And then as you keep your eyes closed, just let the weight of your head come more into your hands. I'm wanting you to do that right now. Just trust that, stay with that, and just notice what's happening. Nobody can see you on this video, so your eyes, with the eyes closed, your mouth can be gently open. Just notice what it's like for your breath. It's as if you were turning your brain off. at least giving it a few moments to reset. If your hands and arms get tight, just change sides. If you need to lean on something, find a table, find a chair, so that there's something supporting your hand as well. Make it work for you. And then you can actually, if you wish to, you can stay in there, but there's another one too that reminds us of self-soothing, self-regulation, self-embodied, brain, body, mind, coming back home, as it were. And that is, find a way to tuck one hand under an arm, doesn't matter left or right, take another hand and wrap it. Find your arm or shoulder and just as if you were hugging yourself. But as you're hugging yourself, just really notice the touch of your hand on your own body, because this truly is where you begin and where you end. You may want to squeeze that. And you can alternate. It's like, oh, that's right, there's my body beneath me. Let me remind myself by hugging and holding myself, changing my hands and finding that sense of contact, and then letting my brain rest. Reminding myself that I'm here. And then you can continue to do variations on this, and they're uniquely timed to yourself. They will have an organic, as it were, wisdom of guiding you. One will feel better than the other. You'll be like, well, wait a minute, she said that, but you know, it feels better here for me. Give yourself permission to let your body guide you exquisitely how your body says, this is who I am, this is what I need. And while you're doing this, become aware of your tailbone where you're seated in the chair right now. Notice the tailbone. Notice what we call the sits bones, just very close to the hips, and begin to become aware of how your tailbone, your pelvis is. And you may by now be wanting to change position, so that you could actually take in the support of the chair beneath you. This is how we actually begin to ground. We have to know that there's something beneath us to make contact with. And you may have noticed that there could be tension in your legs that aren't necessary if you allow your tailbone and your sits bones and hips to actually use the chair beneath you, so that you're not hovering above it. It's actually felt and it's there. And again, it's like, oh, well, there's my tailbone, wow. And maybe the brain is saying, hey, wait a minute, remember me? And you may need to lift your head into it again and close your eyes and notice a deeper breath coming down to your belly if you put your hand there again. Or that you want that containment because you've been so expanded that you've become a shapeshifter. So many clients, so many informations that right now you just need to contract and come back. And there's your tailbone again. Your leg muscles resting on your leg bones, that go down towards your feet. And something even bigger supporting you. Perhaps you could feel that there's earth there as well. So that the body, the brain, your mind, the energetic self of who you are, is beginning to actually say, well, here I am again. I'm back. And it's a gradual process. Now you may know what to do. Now you might want to go and exercise. Now you may know you're tired. Now you might have a sense that you've been hungry. Now you may realize that those emotions of somebody else weren't yours, meant at you. Now you might actually be taking yourself out of the position that you weren't able to take yourself out of when you were young. I don't need to be there anymore, I need to be here. Because the adult you is here. So we're bringing our mind and our brain, our autonomic brain, our limbic brain, into time-space, which is now in the body, in the moment, right? And it's nice to actually even squeeze the body. Even when we take a time out, we come back in, do a bit of a squeeze. None of this is like you need years to go and do specialized training, right? I think I did that for about 5 minutes with you. And some of you may be like, I just kind of want to stay here. And remember that I have a tailbone in my legs. And oh my gosh, I do have a chair that's actually there to support me. So continue that experience as we come into some conclusion of today. Although the time has gone very fast, I must admit that these are my thoughts. They're most probably not the definitive, and I'm very open to suggestion, but I would state and be aware that during this particular time of crisis, your position is more vulnerable. Some people are vulnerable because they're healthcare workers and deal directly with things. You're vulnerable on this level in a particular way. I believe your exquisite and highly honed skills, no matter how you became aware of them, gave you empathy, and your embodiment and empathic processes, if not careful, will come at a high price for you and for the profession and your sense of what is reciprocated in exchange. If you're used to actually doing all the heavy lifting, you may not have quite figured out that you are a stakeholder as well to negotiate what you need in a way that would allow you to reciprocate. You will need to find yourself to self-regulate. And for some of you, that may be a little bit more of a challenge if you come from one of the worlds growing up, that this wasn't perhaps so easy for you because your parents weren't regulated or they couldn't regulate you. You were their regulator. So somatic resources or these body-based ways is one of the, I would like to think it will be a gift that I'm offering you all to help you continue to find your place in the world. Not the world that you were positioned in, but the one that you could step into in a way that now you would have choice. And you could do it differently because another definition of trauma is it never gave you choice. So some of our childhoods never gave us choice. And then we choose our professions and we think we did it with choice. I would invite you to have choice that you can choose to come home to yourself. Your body will be there. It's not going anywhere. Right? So that is the formal ending of this presentation. We do have some time for some other comments and questions there. But...
Fantastic. What a priceless perspective on the work of interpreters with resources that we can use to be more healthy interpreters. Can't thank you enough, Dr. Barnum. And yeah, I've related to the exercises that you led us in this afternoon. I saw several people who had just really positive things to say about that exercise, those exercises. I wish I knew those exercises before I started the presentation. I was a little nervous at the beginning, right? So I think it would have been helpful if I just sat here and did this for a couple minutes before I started, but at the end is good too. And I can say, in all seriousness, I'll certainly integrate this into my practice of being a healthy person, being a healthy interpreter. And I think, I mean, my theory is that the more healthy we are as people, the better we'll be in whatever we do, whether it's interpreting or being a father, mother, you know, any other role we have in the world. So again, thank you so much. We've had several people ask about the recording. I want to say, I said this at the beginning, but we'll get the recording out there sometime in some way. I want to make sure we do it right. And that we protect privacy of anybody who was involved in the call. So I'll be following up with participants who were on the call to make sure that we're all clear for sharing the recording before I do so. But we do have several people that want that. We have people who are asking for the slide decks. I'll try to get a hold of those and send those out. Let me check the chat here. Just a lot of positive comments in the chat. Dr. Barnum, a question about how to learn more exercises like the ones that you guided us in. Do you have any other resources for learning exercises about that?
Those were very specific things I thought about just for you as a community. And I will be curious if there were other things. I would sit myself, I think I would sit more and come up with some other ideas for you all. Or if you can use just that as a basis, I think then you would know, like, okay, well, let me go for a walk, right? Let me do this, let me go do yoga. I wanted actually these exercises to do that initial, I'm not quite back, get me home, right? And because I think even in my years of teaching yoga, and I had a martial art background, if you're still not there, you're just going through the motions.
That's good.
Right. Yeah. You guys are good at going through motions.
Yes. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Thank you all for your comments. So I cannot say how absolutely privileged I've been and feel and honored that you've included me and asked me to be part of this journey with you all. I'm absolutely touched and very, very honored.
Very pleased to have you, Dr. Barnum. Just a couple last words. Again, thank you all for sharing your Saturday afternoon with us. And if you want to keep up with any future offerings from Be Amazing, probably following my page on Facebook is the best way to do that. It could be that once we have the recording, I may post it there. I'm just trying to figure out the best way. Maybe I'll email you directly, but you can follow there. A little bit of a plug related to mental health. In 2021, I'm doing some research corners where we discuss research articles relevant to interpreting. And in February, we'll be looking at the article I mentioned earlier called Conceptualizing Emotion in Healthcare Interpreting. And that will be more of a conversation about emotions in our work. So if you want to join in on that, you can keep your eyes out for that information. Again, thank you all very much. Thank you to the sign language interpreters who volunteered their time today to make this presentation accessible. So thank you so much to the interpreters. There's Charlotte. Yeah, Charlotte and Misty, fantastic job. And I think that wraps it up. Thank you again, Dr. Barnum, and everybody enjoy the rest of your weekend, whether it's cold or warm where you're at. I hope it's warm inside your heart. Be well, be healthy, take care.